Okay, so I'm going to do a quick rundown on chapter 13 and 14, where we're going to talk about the actual structures of the brain itself. A lot of this, even if we were in lecture, I would go through really quickly because it's anatomy. We talk about a lot of the physiology in the lecture portion, and the anatomy comes from your lab. You guys did the brain for lecture 1, or for practical 1, so hopefully this is not a new concept for you all. All right, let me shrink myself down here so that you can see exactly what I'm seeing. The anatomy of the brain is part of the central nervous system within the cranial cavity. You do need to know your 4 major divisions of the brain. You absolutely needed this for lab, so I am going to skip by it. Make sure you brush up on that. But again, I'm not going to ask you in your lecture exam a ton of anatomy questions. I'm more interested in you understanding the function of things. Let me make it work for me. There we go. All right. Again, with the cerebrum, it is the largest portion of the brain. It is the part of the brain that everybody thinks about when they're talking about the brain, the wrinkly bits. And you've got 2 hemispheres, so you've got the right side and the left side. The folds themselves are called gyri or gyrus, depending on whether you're doing singular or plural. The depressions within them are the sulci. And then you will definitely need to know these 3 specific features. So the longitudinal fissure is that big long one that goes down the middle. Lateral separates temporal from frontal and parietal lobes. Again, if you're struggling with any of this, please go back to your lab 1 practical. So none of this is new. Okay. Also should have been with your lab 1 practical. You do need to know the different areas and regions. So this is a really good way to look at it. I like this color slide. There will be questions about what each region does, like what functions does each area perform. So make sure that you know the regions. It will make it a lot easier for you to be able to tell me about the functions, I think, if you learn any way that I do. And we will talk about Wernicke and Broca here a little bit more in a moment. Somatosensory association area. So that entire lecture that I gave you guys on the synapses and sending messages up and down the spinal cord, a lot of that somatosensory stuff went straight here. Not all of it, of course, but just keep that in mind. Tie in what you've learned with your other lectures and how all of this interacts with the brain. All right, so here's where I said you are going to need to know where in the cerebral cortex different regions interpret different senses. So the general sensory area, you'll need to know the primary somatic sensory cortex. Primary somatosensory cortex is right here. And it receives the general input, pain, pressure, temperature, all of the things that are just kind of happening around in a general area. When it says arranged as an upside down half homunculus, please don't let that confuse you. As a matter of fact, I would almost pretend that that is not on the slide. I think that that term is extremely confusing. I'm not going to ask you about a homunculus. If you're curious, it is a very fun thing to Google. You should take a look at what a homunculus is and how that's been defined in the past, just for giggles. Okay, so the taste area is at the inferior end of the post-central gyrus. Let's see. Does it really show it very well here? Yeah, here we go. The taste area, olfactory, you guys saw, hopefully on the brains, you actually got to see olfactory nerves, so you should have a pretty good idea of where those are. auditory complex, that is actually in a really convenient spot because it is right next to where your ears would be. So it is about as close to your ears as it can possibly get, which is very convenient. Now, the visual cortex is a little bit different. The visual cortex, you get your signal that comes in from this area right here, right? It's got to go all the way to the back of your brain in order for your brain to interpret visual signal. So just make sure that you understand where you can find each region. I find that visual and auditory and olfactory are super easy. Once you've got those, go ahead and just take a look at the other regions and know what they do. All right, so we're going a little bit backwards and a little bit forwards with this. So we just talked about reflexes and muscles. You will talk more about muscles in the next section. But of course, the brain controls skeletal muscles. It controls everything. So we're going to talk about that in a number of different ways. So like I said, human body spends a ton of time keeping itself from falling over. Being a biped is not the most efficient way to travel necessarily. There's lots of benefits, but there's lots of cons that go along with it too. But your motor system helps you maintain posture and balance and also helps move everything, including your face, your speech, all of those little things. You should know what a reflex is after chapter 12. I just put a video up on that. It's about 30 minutes long. Voluntary movements are the ones that you do to achieve a specific goal. There are 3 steps. In order to make a voluntary movement, your body has to go through 3 steps. So first, you have to have the thought that you want to make a voluntary movement, whether it's a conscious thought or something that, it just happens because you've done it, so many times. It starts in the premotor area of the cerebral cortex, and it stimulates the upper motor neurons. This is why I want you to go back and make sure you've got a good grip on chapter 12 before you come forward to this. And then the axons of the upper motor neurons go down those descending nerve tracts that I told you about in the last chapter. They stimulate the lower motor neurons, and that is what stimulates the skeletal muscles to contract. So the cerebral cortex interacts using the system to plan, coordinate, and execute movements. If you have any more questions about this, like I said, this is going to be a super quick run through of the lecture to give you a chance to just get a general idea of what this is before you go back and start to really evaluate it, and watch the other videos that I gave you to help you with this, and then go to your discussion and we can go from there. All right, so the primary motor cortex is about 30% of upper neurons. Another 30% are in the premotor area, and the rest is in the somatic sensory cortex. Remember, I told you whenever you see soma, that means body. You will see that term over and over and over again, so learn it now. It will always give you a little bit of a hint if you've forgotten a term. Let's see. All right, so modifying and refining motor activities, you need to know what the cerebrum does, right? So you need to know planning, organizing, coordinating movements, posture, that there are feedback loops that can stimulate muscle activity. So like if you get up out of a chair, there is a stimulatory feedback loop. They're also inhibitory. We talked in the reflex about how when you contract one muscle in order to actually make the movement, the antagonistic muscle or the opposite muscle has got to relax. So the cerebrum plays a part in that as well. The cerebellum helps maintain muscle tone in the postural muscles. So in other words, helping to keep yourself upright in the position that you are supposed to be standing in. It helps control balance during movement, and it helps coordinate eye movements. So things that happen in the cerebellum are less deliberate. I mean, of course, it can be, something that you actually think about, but they are more likely to be things that are less deliberate than the things that are happening in the cerebrum. All right, so the Wernicke and Broca area, these are actually, they're super, super cool. They are two different regions of your brain that work together with one another. So the Wernicke area itself is where you take information, sensory speech. So as I am speaking to you right now, your Wernicke area is active. So you're understanding what you're hearing. And now if we were face to face and we were going to have a conversation, that Wernicke area would be active, not only understanding what you're hearing, but thinking, processing what you're going to say in response, right? So that's great. The Wernicke area can process it and kind of formulate a response. But in order to communicate that response, you have to have use of the Broca area. This is the actual motor speech area. So the information, what you want to say, travels from the Wernicke area to the Broca area, and the Broca area actually sends the messages to the muscles to make the sounds. So if your Broca area is damaged, you might hear the information, you might know what you want to say, but you either make no sound or what comes out is a bunch of nonsensical information. There have been really cool studies done with this. There are people that have learned ways around this. So for example, this one woman, her Broca area was damaged, so she couldn't actually talk when she would try to communicate something. She knew what she wanted to say, but what would come out, and it may have been a he actually, but what would come out would be just a jumbled mess. Like it didn't amount to anything. So while this person was waiting for those neurons to make the connection again in their brain after the injury, they found they were able to sing all of their responses. And through singing their responses, they were able to help form those neurons and start to make those connections again, so that over a period of time, they were able to talk normally again. But that was their way of communicating because it used a different region of the brain, which is freaking amazing. Like, the brain is really cool. We offer a neuro class here at the university, and if I had time, I would take it because it's just, we know so little about it, right? And yet so much. But there's a connection between these two regions called the arcuate fasciculus. Let's say that 5 times fast. And it is how the information, it travels unidirectionally. So if you notice, the information comes into the Wernicke area, which also conveniently is parallel to about where your ear would be, even though it's on the inside. And then it travels through this arcuate fasciculus. I always have to slow myself down to go to the Broca area, which will then translate things into words. But if you're curious, I am really sure that it should be super easy for you to find information about that person that I'm talking about. Just put like Broca area singing words or something like that, and you'll find it. So what I need you to know from this is that in order to read aloud a word that you see, it has to go into your primary visual cortex. It has to be processed by your Wernicke area. You need to figure out what you're going to say back there. It then moves through the arcuate fasciculus and goes to the Broca area. Then it goes to the primary motor cortex, and the words will come out. So to repeat a word that you hear, it's the same type of thing, only instead of the primary visual cortex sending the information, you get the information through the primary auditory cortex. So on the exam, you might see something like this where something is left out, or you might see something like this, but it's scrambled up in the wrong order and you have to put it in the right order. So make sure that you understand how this system works. Okay, so this particular topic, communication between the left and right hemisphere, there's recently been a little bit of contention that it's not as clearly defined as most people are taught. There may actually be more contention that I know of. I'm not a neurologist, and they're constantly doing things with this. But, you know, when you're a kid, you hear, you know, hey, you know, your right brain does this and your left brain does this and your right side controls the left side of the body, et cetera, et cetera. It's not quite that clear cut. Whenever you're dealing with a brain, it's really not that clear cut. But the right side of the body controls the muscular activity and receives sensory information from the left side of the body in general. So I want you to take this information and compare it with that extensor reflex that we just talked about in the last section that I put up. And then the left, of course, controls muscular activity in the right side of the body. By the way, that's her being a dog. She's been doing that on and off all day. Okay, sorry. I had to, that can be very distracting. Anyway, so there is information that occurs in the left and the right that needs to cross over to these two different hemispheres, and they do it through these commissures, specifically in this case, the corpus callosum. So make sure that you understand that the corpus callosum is how these two halves of the brain are talking to each other. It's how they're sharing information. But language and artistic activities and lots of different things. Just language and artistic are the only two, like, to use as an example that's very clear cut. It's not shared equally. So it's not, you know, artistic activity isn't going to entirely be coming from the right side of your brain, or language won't necessarily all come from the right side of your brain. Like if you notice here, you know, you'll have some language in order to formulate particular thoughts and creative thoughts. If you think about creative, you know, speeches, that sort of thing, part of that is from the right side of your brain, part of it comes from the left side of your brain. But in general, the terms that you hear are that the left side of your brain controls mathematics and speech, and the right side of your brain does the three-dimensional spatial perception, recognition of faces, musical ability. That's really more the creative side. So I spent a decade in school training the left side of my brain. Every day for a decade, I focused on the left side of my brain. Play a little bit of a musical instrument, didn't even really do it that much. I totally believed by the time I was done, the right side of my brain had completely atrophied. Like if you, the only thing that I think I worked on with the right side of my brain is, as a biochemist, you've got to be able to envision organic molecules, that three-dimensional and spatial stuff that was going on. That I kind of worked on that. Recognizing faces. I am amazing at that. Kind of take pride at the fact that even though I haven't seen you guys in weeks, you were in my class long enough that I might see you 10 years from now, and I will look at you and say, I know you from somewhere. I won't remember your name. I'll be honest. I'm terrible at names. However, I will remember your face, and eventually I will get to where I know it from. But I was totally convinced the right side of my brain atrophied. So after 10 years of working in the math and science and all of that stuff, shortly after I graduated, I started like exercising that right side again. So it's actually really good for you to kind of balance yourself out. I ate, lived, and breathed science. So when I finished what I was trying to get to. I backed off of that just a little bit. And I highly recommend you guys do that too. It's actually really good for you, good for your IQ, lots of other things. All right, so in the cerebral medulla, there are all of these fibers that cross over one another and they help share information between these regions. Make sure that you know what these are. This is a lot of memorization at this point, but it is here for you and I can always answer questions. All right, the brainstem. So the first time I ever saw this picture or something like it just sort of blows my mind because that doesn't even look like anything you would expect to see in a human body. But this is the portion of the brainstem that connects to the spinal cord and to the base of the whole rest of the brain. So that very bottom portion that you see. You need to be able to divide this brainstem into the three major regions. So now, what I want to point out here is that if you are looking at this, if you notice, it says anterior view. So what that would mean is that if you had a person's face superimposed over this, they would be looking directly at you. This is the anterior. You're looking at the front of that portion of the stem, just to help you orient yourself. A lot of the autonomic and essential functions that your body needs to perform are done in the brainstem. All right, so again, we're looking at the anterior view of the brainstem. I told you there are three sections you need to know. Make sure that that you know these areas. I'm not going to ask you on this slide specifically about which cranial nerves originate from it. That is definitely an anatomy thing. However, you do need to know that the medulla oblongata, what it regulates, and have a general idea of where you can find it. You should have a really good idea of where to find it for your lab. All right, the pons, it is the same thing. It is superior to the medulla oblongata, so it's directly above that. This slide talks a little bit about the fiber tract, so compare that with a couple of slides ago to pull that together in your head. The pons is actually the sleep center of your brain. We're going to talk a lot about sleep at the end of this chapter. Really wish, this is one of the best discussions that I get out of people all year, and I'm really sad we're not going to have it. So make sure that you understand the function of the pons. Same with the midbrain. The midbrain, depending on who you're talking to, where is my mouse? Depending on who you're talking to is also called the mesencephalon. I do not need to know which cranial nerves originate from it, but you do, let me see. You need to know that there are two superior colliculi and two inferior colliculi that correspond to visual reflexes and hearing. Am I going to give you a picture and ask you where they are? No. But you should be able to tell me they're in the midbrain and what they do. And then you need to know that there are tracts that are in this region. We talked about tracts a lot with the spinal cord, so you need to know what the ascending and descending tracts do and tie that information in with what you learned in the last chapter. Okay. In this case, with the brainstem functions, you need to know that the brainstem, remember I said a portion of the brainstem was the sleep center, and that sort of goes with this reticular activating system that controls the sleep-wake cycle. In order for it to control that cycle, it has to have a direct signal from the outside that tells your body what time of day it is. Um, this is actually one of the big problems that we as a current society have with sleep. So, for example, back before we had electricity, the sun went down when the sun went down. You used candles if you had the money to have them. If you didn't, it got dark. Your brain started to produce melatonin at a certain time as the sun hit a certain point, and you went to bed because you didn't have a whole lot of other options. As time went on, we had electricity, so we could start to ignore that. It still wasn't too terribly bad until we started getting into the use of a lot of electronics. The theory is that the blue light actually stimulates this region in a way that suppresses those normal circadian rhythms that tend to happen. And that all of that signal is received by a portion of the brainstem. So you do need to know that, and I know you guys had to learn the cranial nerves for your lab, but you need to remember that cranial nerve 2 is your optic nerve and 8 is the vestibulocochlear nerve. So signals from your eyes and signals from your ears. And this here explains, or just basically says, this is how the wakefulness is maintained. What information is your brain getting, and where is it coming from? Is it being processed somewhere first? So make sure that you understand that. All right, so with this in particular, I want you to know the first two bullets. The brainstem is where all of these different motor pathways and reflexes, it's where all this information comes together. Do I need you to like memorize which cranial nerve goes with which thing? Not specifically. I need you to know, what is part of the somatic system. So somatic motors, eye movements, reflexes, chewing, facial expression, speech, that sort of thing. And then the parasympathetic is, remember, parasympathetic is rest and relax, right? So pupil constriction, sneezing, salivation, gagging, coughing, rest and digest. Sorry, I said that wrong. That is your parasympathetic system. So try to tie those together. I don't need to know which cranial nerve goes with which. Okay. All right. Again, this is very anatomy heavy. Make sure that you do know what the portions of the cerebellum are. You will need that. Not from this class for this point on, but you will need it again. But make sure you know this very bottom paragraph here, what functions happen in the cerebellum. All right, the same with the diencephalon, which is also known as the thalamus, which is this small little area right here. This you did not really get a good view of in your lab. It's actually kind of difficult to see without a model, so I would make sure that you know that the thalamus is responsible for coordinating sensory information, motor function. It is connected to the limbic system, which we will talk about here in a moment, but it plays a large role in mood modification, emotional regulation, and sensory integration. We're going to talk about the limbic system in a minute. Emotions and moods definitely tie into that. But if you notice here, like all of these regions that we're talking about, the senses kind of tend to come up over and over and over again because we have senses that feed in through so many different places and so many different ways, just on a you're constantly barraged by information. So the input comes from or is processed by multiple different regions of your brain. All right, the epithalamus, you do need to know. Also the diencephalon, you do need to know. Motivational control and behavior happens in the habenula. And then the pineal gland, again, when we're talking about the sleep-wake cycle, There's some other biorhythms. We are not going to go into all of those as much as I would like to. I'm going to try to stay on track. The pineal gland monitors that, or helps modulate the sleep-wake cycle. So as you're going through these slides, when we get down to the bottom here and I start talking about the sleep-wake cycle, I want you to go through and list all the parts of the brain that play a role in this, and you will see how many things orchestrate are important to that cycle all by itself, and you will realize how easy it is to start to have issues with that. How so many people can become an insomniac or something different. All right, this, you will need to know the definitions for these things and where they are found, and what they are important in doing. So here we go again with mood, emotion, in this case, sexual pleasure, satiation, rage, and fear. Let me look at something really quickly. Okay. Whoop. Okay. I will probably wind up revisiting this with questions from you guys, because I usually wind up getting some kind of questions about the limbic system, and the limbic system is sort of the primal part of your brain that plays a role in that mood, sexual pleasure, satiation, rage, and fear. They call it the lizard brain. It does not in itself have a whole lot of like higher order function. It is very much like that automatic, response region, and it's more of a way to procreate and protect yourself. That is what the limbic system does. That is its role. You could have a whole class on this. I think it's really interesting, and I feel like we're going to come back to that, so I will leave it be for now. All right, so again, we are back into anatomy. We talked about dura mater, arachnoid matter, pia mater, in the last lecture, so I'm not going to go over that again. Let's see. Again, this is all definitions. You do need to know them. You need to know where you will find them. And if you see, we are starting to see a lot of repeats of stuff, right? So if you got a really good grip on it, then you're good here. Okay. Don't think there's anything specific. What I would do, you do need to know the ventricles. Before you ask any questions about the ventricles, I want you to look at where they are, and then I want you to compare where they are to what those regions do. And I'd like you to just sort of take a little time processing those things. I think that once you get a grasp on, where you will find these, what region they're in, what that region does, it will make this particular slide a lot easier. Okay, so I am going to let you guys take a little time with this cerebrospinal fluid. The brain itself only has a couple of points where, hang on. Okay, the brain itself only has a couple of points where it actually comes into contact with blood. It's for good reason. We talked about, blood is just, it's filthy. It's filled with all different kinds of germs and bacteria, and there's a reason that we have entire classes on bloodborne pathogens, and the last thing you want is for any of that to touch your brain directly. So most of the time you get flow through the cerebrospinal fluid. So what I want you to do is take a look, make sure that you know how the cerebrospinal fluid flows, because remember, it goes all the way up and washes across your brain and also goes down your spinal column. It plays a very big role. This is very recently discovered in helping your brain while you're asleep, but we will get to that. So this is sort of a backup it's exactly what was on this previous slide here. Just make sure that you understand the flow and that this CSF flow that you see right here, you should have, a decent idea. Do I need you to know step by step? No, but if I were to give you this, you should know which way it flows and what it goes into, if that makes sense. Okay. All right. Okay, we are actually going to stop right here for this particular video. I will pick up the rest of it tomorrow, and this is where I was talking about that blood-brain barrier, so I will get to that more tomorrow. Thanks, guys. I hope this was helpful.